In this video, we will gonna have a look at the so-called fantasy variation. The fantasy variation is characterized by the opening moves e4, c6, d4, d5, and f3. On the first glance, this move seems a bit strange, because white cannot play knight f3 anymore. Neither does white develop a single piece with the move f3. This move is a pretty aggressive move which leads to fresh positions, non-standard positions, where white wants to get an advantage in a bit of an offbeat opening. When I worked on this series, I kept procrastinating analyzing the fantasy variation because I thought that black must be fine, frankly, no matter what he plays. However, this is not the case. The fantasy variation is a pretty serious opening, and you need to be prepared for it. If you want to face it without any special preparation, you might find yourself in hot waters. So, it is not a stupid opening. I recommend the move e6. Here white has two options, knight c3 or bishop e3. After bishop e3, we play the greedy move queen b6. We are threatening the pawn on b2, and we are willing to take it. White has two moves, knight d2 and queen c1. Queen c1 looks very passive, but there is also some venom in there. c5, d takes c, bishop takes c5, bishop takes, queen takes, and here white can try the crazy looking queen g5. We give a check, c3, and we take on b2. White takes on g7, knight d7, queen h8, and king f8. This is not traditionally equal, but it is mathematically balanced. I think the engine says 0.0 in this position, which indicates that there might even be a forced draw somewhere. Black will go on to take the rook on a1, restoring material balance, and the position is pretty fine. The most principled move and the critical test is the move knight to d2. And black should pick up the gauntlet here and take on b2. Bishop d3, queen a3, knight e2, and the thematic move c5. White takes, bishop takes, knight d4, a6. a6 stops all sorts of knight b5 ideas or bishop b5 check. White can castle and knight f6. It is important to play knight f6 rather than e5. e5 is pretty risky because white can sacrifice a piece. After e takes d5, e takes d4, bishop f4, knight e7, knight c4. White has tremendous compensation for the material investment, and I don't like black's position. So knight f6, knight 2 to b3, bishop a7, e5, knight fd7, f4, knight c6. Both sides develop their pieces. Queen f3, we take everything on d4 and pin the knight. Queen c5, queen e3, castle, rook f3 and g6. And now we should take some time to talk about the position. Black is currently a pawn up, but white is threatening rook h3, queen g3, queen h4 and mate on h7. In other words, our king side is a bit weakened. What we want to do with black is to play b5, knight b6 and knight c4, and bring the rook to a7. On a7, the rook will be able to defend our king side. In some moment, black might even consider to push f6, after which the h7 pawn would be protected. I think that white has sufficient compensation for the sacrificed pawn, and the position should be dynamically equal. I don't think that white has more than sufficient compensation for the piece, and black's position should be very playable. However, of course there are some dangers, but the good news is we are pawn up. I wouldn't be scared to play it, but obviously black needs to be a bit precise and things can go wrong. So it's not a play on one goal. The main move, however, is for knight c3. Bishop b4. White has quite a number of options here. For example, the move bishop f4. We play knight f6. White has two moves here, bishop d3 or queen d3. After bishop d3, we play our thematic move c5. a3, takes, c4, and after bishop e2, knight c6, e5, knight g8, knight h3, queen a5, bishop d2, b5, we have a position that is reminiscent of the Vinava French. White has quite a number of pawn weaknesses. He has an isolated pawn on a3 and a doubled pawn along the c-file. Black has an outpost on f5 where he can bring his knight and the better structure on the queen side. The position is double-edged and both sides have their chances, but I don't think that black is in trouble here. If white plays 6 queen d3, we can castle. White has two moves, knight e2 or long castle. If white castles long, then b5, knight h3 and bishop e7. The bishop on b4 didn't have any purpose there anymore, and it makes space for the pawn to push. a5 and b4 are ideas in this position. The knight can be transferred to c4. Black's position is very nice. If white plays knight e2, we play b5, a3, bishop e7, bishop g5, a5, h4, bishop a6, threatening b4. White plays b4 himself, and we play bishop b7. In this position black has many ideas. For now the pawn on b4 is hanging. White must do something about it, and black can either transfer his knight via d7, b6 to c4, or he can play knight a6, again hitting the pawn on b4. All in all, black is already slightly better here. Let's have a look at the move queen d3 on move 5. b6, threatening bishop a6. Queen e3, knight f6, e5, knight fd7, f4 c5, knight f3, knight c6. White has two moves here, either a3 or knight b5, bishop b5. After a3, black takes on d4, knight takes, queen takes, bishop c5, queen d1 and a5. a5 is stabilizing the center, the bishop cannot be attacked, and black's position is very fine. We will castle and maybe play f6. The white pawn on f4 is not really stable there. White can't even castle short at the moment because the bishop on c5 is hindering him. I think black's position is very pleasant, if not already slightly better. If bishop b5 instead of a3, we go queen c7, a3, takes, bishop c5, queen d1, and now instead of a5 we play a6 first, and forcing white to take a decision. Either take the knight on d7 or retreat with the bishop. In any case, black already enjoys a slight pull. White cannot castle at the moment. We will castle and push f6 with a slight advantage for black. What else does white have? There is the move fifth e5, knight e7, a3, takes, c5, f4, queen f5, bishop d2, queen a4, bishop e2 and b6. The idea of b6 is to play bishop a6 and trade off the bishops. The bishop on e2 is white's good bishop. Once it is gone, there will be many light squared weaknesses in white's camp. Our bishop on c8, however, is our bad bishop, and we would gladly trade it off. Black has a nice square on f5 and a nice outpost on c4. Black will try to bring the rook over to c8 and play along the c-file, where white has many pawn islands and doubled pawns. This structure is very desirable for black, and if someone is better here, it is already black. The main move, however, is knight to e2. One last thing, maybe, there is also bishop d2. I would like to show you very briefly an idea. This move is not critical, but there's something you should keep in mind. A very nice idea. I just browse through the moves. And in this position, black can play knight to e5. The pawn on d4 is pinned, and black is ready to play, for example, knight to d4, or take white's good bishop on d3. Black is already better. White's probably best move is knight e2. We go knight e7, bishop e3. And there's also the move a3, which is not critical. We go back, bishop e3, castle, queen d2, and here I really like the idea bishop c7. What is the idea of bishop c7? The bishop is retreating in order to push our pawns. We want to play b5 and a5. The bishop wasn't doing much on a5 anyway, so we move it back to c7. We also support the break e6, e5, or f7, f5 when the bishop is protecting the e5 and f4 squares. Yeah, white has two moves here, long castle on knight g3. After knight g3, we play f5. White has two moves, e5 or ef. After ef5, we take it with the pawn, knight ge2 and rook e8. It's clear that black has a very nice position. After e5, we play c5, immediately undermining the center with a very nice position for black. And if white castles, we play b5. And a5 will come very soon. We can bring the knight to c4 via d7, b6, c4, or we can start with a5, potentially b4. And it is clear that white's attack is very slow. White needs to play h4, g4, h5. This takes ages. Black is already attacking. Saying this, there is also an alternative to bishop c7. Black can also try knight d7, which is also fine. After knight g3, f5, takes. We have a similar position. Black can play bishop c7 soon, which would probably transpose into one of the variations we've seen earlier. The main move is bishop e3, castle, queen d2 and c5, immediately hitting the center. And this is initiating a forced sequence, at the end of which black is completely fine. White takes on c5. If white goes a3, we take on d4, bishop a5, long castle, and we have the move d takes e4. The point is that queen a5 is not a problem. It looks problematic because g7 is hanging and the queen is a bit awkwardly placed opposite to the rook on d1, but we have the move just knight f5. Knight f5 is protecting the g7 pawn and is offering a trade of queens. White can hardly decline that offer, and black is fine. So white takes on e4 instead, black plays knight c6, bishop e3 and a6. Of course the trade of queens would be very good for black, because white has a worse pawn structure, an isolated pawn on e4, If white plays queen e1 instead, we can move our queen probably to c7, and black is also here very fine. The idea is to play b5, potentially b4, and attack the white king. As in the line we saw earlier, it is much more difficult for white to attack the black king than it is for black to attack the white king. So white takes on c5 instead. We take on e4, queen d8, rook d8, a3, and here we have a very nice move, knight to f5, hitting the bishop on e3. Bishop f2, we take, knight c6, the d4 square is in our hands, bishop d3, knight d4, knight f to d4 that is, and here play could continue, bishop d4, knight d4, long castle and e5. And the outpost on d4 is so nice, we have the better pawn structure, black goes just fine. So all in all, the fantasy variation is a variation you should take very serious. It is not a given that black gets an equal position. You need to be precise. There are a number of ideas you need to know, but I think I showed you some ways to neutralize this idea and get a very playable position. Important is that if white castles kingside, queenside, if white castles long, black can always play with b5 and a5 and get an attack going. The bishop is well placed on c7 in these scenarios because it defends all black squares on d6, e5 and f4.